Hey there. Welcome back. It seems you've been giving some thought to all these hidden forces that kind of shape our world.
Yes, indeed.
You've shared some excerpts from Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point, articles about social change and medical practices, even some research on cultural trends.
It's quite a collection.
It is going to be fascinating unpacking this all together.
It is. It really points to these powerful, often unseen forces that shape our world.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore how these forces drive epidemics, influence communities, and maybe even consider whether we can kind of harness them for positive change.
Right. Let's dive in. Gladwell kicks off his book with this congressional hearing about an unnamed epidemic. And what struck me was how all the witnesses, while expressing empathy, they all avoid taking direct responsibility.
Right.
They use this passive language, like saying has also been associated with, as if it were some random force of nature, this crisis.
It's a fascinating observation, and Gladwell argues that this type of passive language is a symptom of a larger phenomenon. Our reluctance to acknowledge our role in creating and shaping epidemics. We see epidemics as things that just happen to us, not as consequences of choices made by individuals.
Right.
He uses the example of the LA bank robbery epidemic in the 80s and 90s to illustrate this point.
Yeah, it's easy to think of that crime wave as just a sign of the times, right?
Right.
But Gladwell highlights how it was actually driven by a few key individuals. He calls them super spreaders of criminal behavior. Like, for instance, Casper and Sea Dog masterminded up to 175 robberies without ever actually robbing a bank themselves.
Wow.
They created this blueprint for copycat crimes.
Yeah.
It almost makes you wonder if we could identify these super spreaders in other contexts.
It does raise that question, doesn't it? But for now, let's shift gears and talk about a less intense topic. Medical practices.
Okay.
I think you'll find the work of John Wenberg particularly interesting. He discovered huge differences in how doctors treated patients in different communities,
Right.
even when the communities seemed similar on the surface.
Yeah, this small area variation stuff really blew my mind. The example of tonsillectomy and appendectomy rates in Vermont
Right.
really hits hometowns just miles apart had wildly different rates of these procedures. Makes you stop and wonder what on earth was driving those decisions.
Exactly. And it challenges this assumption that medical decisions are always based on purely objective medical factors.
Yeah, right.
We see this same pattern with vaccination rates in California schools.
Okay.
Waldorf schools consistently have much lower vaccination rates than other private schools.
Interesting.
And it's not just that they attract anti-vaccine parents. It's that something about the Waldorf overstory, their philosophy culture community, influences parental choices. It's almost like a cultural contagion.
So even people who might have come in with different views on vaccines can be swayed by the dominant culture of the community.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how your own community might be shaping your decisions without you even realizing it.
That's a crucial insight, isn't it? And these overstories don't just impact schools and medical practices. They can influence everything from business ethics to crime rates. Gladwell uses the story of Philippus Formes, a businessman who moved to Miami and got caught up in a massive Medicare fraud case to illustrate this.
Yeah, Formes' story is a stark reminder that our environment shapes us more than we think.
Right. His lawyer argued that he was essentially a decent guy who got swept up in Miami's pervasive culture of corruption.
Right.
And that's where the idea of the overstory gets really interesting. Miami had a unique overstory.
Okay.
Shaped by a confluence of factors: the influx of Cuban refugees in the 1980s, the rise of the cocaine trade, and a long history of Medicare fraud.
Wow.
It almost felt like a different country with its own set of rules and norms.
They even had these healthcare malls full of fake medical offices all set up to bilk the system. Imagine entire shopping centers dedicated to fraud.
It's chilling.
It's a chilling illustration of how powerful overstories can be.
It is a vivid image, isn't it? And it wasn't just elaborate schemes like that. People like the Delgado brothers, who started small, got gradually pulled deeper into the world of Medicare fraud.
Right.
The Miami overstory enabled and encouraged their behavior, making it seem almost normal. And this brings us to the question of how overstories exert this power. It seems like group proportions play a crucial role here. Gladwell introduces this concept of a magic third.
Right. The idea is that when a minority group reaches about a third of the total population, it can fundamentally change the dynamics of the whole group. This idea is supported by Rosebeth Kanter's work on women in corporate settings. She found that solo women often felt tokenized and pressured, but with a critical mass of women, the dynamic shifted.
Exactly. And this idea isn't just theoretical. Damon Santola conducted an online experiment where participants had to agree on a name. A minority pushing for a different name only succeeded when they reached 25% of the group. It's a compelling demonstration of how a minority can shift consensus when they reach a certain threshold.
And it makes you think about the implications for social change. If we know that group proportions matter this much, could we potentially engineer those proportions to achieve better outcomes? This leads us to the story of Harvard University and their decision to add a women's rugby team.
On the surface, it seemed like a rather odd decision. Rugby isn't exactly a mainstream sport.
Right.
But as Gladwell dug deeper, he uncovered a fascinating pattern in Harvard's admissions process.
It turns out athletes get a significant advantage in college admissions, even in less popular sports, and Harvard has a history of using athletics to maintain certain group proportions within their student body. That's ironic, isn't it? They fiercely defended their use of race in admissions to achieve diversity, but they were simultaneously using athletics to maintain a predominantly white student body.
That's a really insightful observation, it seems. They were saying one thing and doing another, and this connects to the story of the Lawrence Tract, a community in Palo Alto that was intentionally designed to achieve racial harmony.
A noble goal for sure, but to maintain their ideal racial balance, they ended up excluding black families. Their desire to prevent white flight led them to a form of exclusion themselves. It highlights the ethical complexities that can arise when we start manipulating group proportions.
It's a cautionary tale for sure, but perhaps even more challenging is how this dilemma plays out in the context of public health. The Biogen Leadership Conference in Boston, a superspreader event that fueled the early spread of COVID-19, brings this into sharp focus.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder of how a single event can have massive consequences. It also raises questions about how much we knew about the science of superspreaders and the role of aerosols in disease transmission.
You might be surprised to learn that for a long time we underestimated the role of aerosols in the spread of COVID-19. The focus was on coughing and sneezing. But research by William Ristenpart, a chemical engineer, showed that even talking and breathing can generate aerosols that carry the virus.
So we've learned that these tiny particles can linger in the air, and that some individuals' superspreaders exhale significantly more aerosols than others. This knowledge presents a real ethical dilemma. If we could identify those superspreaders, should we restrict their activities for the sake of public health?
It's a tough question with significant ethical implications, and it speaks to a broader point that Gladwell makes. We can't afford to be passive observers when it comes to epidemics. We need to understand the forces driving them, even if that means confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our communities. But it's not all doom and gloom. We also have inspiring stories about how people have intentionally shifted overstories for good. The story of Holocaust survivors in Los Angeles is a powerful example.
It's a story about the power of storytelling and its ability to shift narratives. These survivors faced resistance and a reluctance to confront a painful past, but they persisted in sharing their stories. Their efforts eventually led to the founding of the first Holocaust Museum in the U.S.
And the production of the TV miniseries Holocaust in the 1970s, while certainly flawed, played a huge role in raising awareness and understanding. It's a powerful example of how storytelling can shift over stories and bring important issues to light. It reminds us that even deeply ingrained overstories can be challenged and changed. And this brings us to another example of dramatic social change, the fight for same-sex marriage.
For decades, progress on gay rights was slow, and many thought marriage equality was an unattainable goal, but then something shifted.
This is where cultural overstories come into play again. The portrayal of gay characters in popular culture evolved over time, shifting from isolated, troubled individuals to depictions of loving, supportive relationships. Shows like Will and Grace helped normalize same-sex relationships and create a more accepting cultural overstory. And the shift in public opinion happened much faster than anyone anticipated. It highlights the power of storytelling to influence social change.
But it's important to remember that shifting over stories isn't always positive. The opioid epidemic is a stark reminder of how powerful and harmful those shifts can be.
The crisis was driven by a complex interplay of factors. Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed OxyContin, downplaying its addictive potential. McKinsey & Company advised them to target high-prescribing doctors, essentially focusing on superspreaders of opioid prescriptions, and the absence of triplicate prescription laws in many states made it easier for doctors to overprescribe.
It was almost a perfect storm of bad decisions and systemic failures, however. Gladwell highlights a glimmer of hope in the legacy of Paul Madden, who created an overstory in California that emphasized regulating opioid prescriptions.
The tragic irony is that the states without Madden's system were hit hardest by the epidemic. It makes you think, could intentionally making OxyContin harder to abuse have actually saved lives? It seems counterintuitive, but the unintended consequences of making it easier to prescribe may have fueled the crisis.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here, from epidemics of crime to medical practices, social change, and public health crises. It seems like these hidden forces are at play everywhere.
Indeed, and we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
I think this is a good place to pause. For now, we'll continue this fascinating discussion in part 2 of our deep dive.
As we delve deeper into these examples, a common thread emerges. The LA bank robberies, the Miami Medicare fraud, the Biogen outbreak. They all highlight how seemingly random events are often driven by these underlying dynamics of tipping points, overstories, and even superspreaders.
It really is remarkable how these seemingly disparate events share these underlying patterns. It seems like we tend to fixate on the surface level events while missing the deeper forces that shape the course of things.
Exactly, and that's why recognizing the existence of these forces and understanding their potential impact is so crucial. We need to be more discerning, questioning our assumptions, and looking for those deeper patterns at play.
You're right, it's easy to just go with the flow, but stepping back to examine those underlying currents can be incredibly insightful. It might even help us feel less helpless when faced with seemingly overwhelming forces.
It might even empower us to nudge those forces in a more positive direction. Instead of simply reacting, we can become more proactive in shaping the ideas we spread, the behaviors we model, and the communities we cultivate.
Speaking of shaping communities, it's interesting to revisit Gladwell's concept of the magic third. We talked about it earlier in the context of women in corporate settings and racial achievement gaps in schools. It's that tipping point where a minority group reaches a critical mass and can fundamentally change the group's dynamics. Knowing that group proportions have this much influence, shouldn't we actively try to shift those proportions to achieve better outcomes?
It's a question with significant ethical implications, isn't it? Creating more diverse and inclusive environments is generally seen as a positive goal. But at the same time, the idea of engineering social groups based on some predetermined formula can feel uncomfortable.
It feels almost intrusive, right? Like we're imposing some artificial structure on naturally occurring social dynamics. And the story of the Lawrence Tract really brings those concerns to light. Their efforts to create a racially harmonious community led them to exclude Black families. Even with the best of intentions, it seems we can create new problems while trying to solve old ones.
It's a reminder that social engineering can have unforeseen consequences no matter how noble the goal. And these ethical dilemmas become even more pronounced when we consider public health, particularly in the context of a pandemic.
The Biogen conference, that superspreader event early in the COVID-19 pandemic, really brings those complexities to the forefront. On the one hand, protecting public health and preventing the spread of deadly diseases is crucial. But on the other hand, we value individual freedom and autonomy. How do we reconcile those two?
It's a constant balancing act, isn't it? And the science of superspreaders adds another layer of complexity. We now know that certain individuals, due to factors like age, BMI, and even hydration levels, can exhale significantly more virus particles than others.
So knowing that, would it be ethical to restrict the movements or activities of those identified as superspreaders?
It's a question with no easy answers. It touches on a fundamental tension between individual rights and collective well-being.
It's a dilemma that extends beyond public health, doesn't it? We see similar challenges in criminal justice and national security. If we can identify individuals statistically more likely to commit crimes or engage in terrorism, should we preemptively intervene?
Absolutely. These are challenging questions that require thoughtful consideration and open discussion. We need to engage in these debates, grapple with the ethical complexities, and consider the potential trade-offs.
And be mindful of the slippery slope. When we start restricting individual liberties for the sake of collective good, where do we draw the line?
That's a crucial point. It requires careful navigation, informed decision-making, and a commitment to transparency and accountability. But while we focused on how these forces can have negative consequences, let's not forget their potential for positive change.
Right. We've seen how stories can shift over stories for good, like the Holocaust survivors who bravely shared their experiences and helped raise awareness. And the evolution of LGBTQ+ representation in media demonstrates how cultural overstories can become more inclusive over time. These examples offer a glimmer of hope that we can intentionally shape these forces toward a better future.
Precisely. It's not about being passive observers. It's about actively engaging, utilizing our knowledge, and nudging those tipping points in a positive direction. It begins with recognizing our own power to influence the overstories and group proportions within our own circles.
Absolutely. Imagine if each of us consciously chose to be super spreaders of kindness, compassion, and understanding.
What a powerful thought.
Yeah.
And imagine the impact if we all committed to building communities where diversity is valued and celebrated, where everyone feels a sense of belonging, and where differences are viewed as strengths rather than threats.
It's a powerful reminder that we have more agency than we realize. We can choose to be part of the solution rather than simply subject to these forces.
Indeed. Even small acts can have a ripple effect, potentially tipping the scales towards a more just and equitable world. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of our actions and how they contribute to larger patterns.
Well, I think that's a great place to pause for a moment. We've discussed the complex interplay of these forces, their potential for both harm and good, and the ethical challenges they present. But there's still much more to explore.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into the ethical implications of knowing about superspreaders, the ongoing struggle to balance individual rights with the collective good, and the enduring power of storytelling to shape our world.
Welcome back. As we're wrapping up our deep dive into these tipping points and overstories, a question keeps coming back to me, like, what are the ethics of knowing?
Right.
We've talked about how all these forces, these overstories, these superspreaders can drive epidemics, but what do we do with that knowledge?
It's a question that's been kind of lurking throughout our conversation, hasn't it? It's one thing to recognize these patterns, but another entirely to grapple with the implications of that knowledge.
Right.
The story of Paul Mann, the California drug czar who created that system for tracking opioid prescriptions, really highlights this ethical quandary.
On the one hand, his efforts to regulate those drugs probably did prevent, some instances of overprescribing and addiction.
Right.
But on the other hand, his system might have created a stigma around opioids, making some doctors hesitant to prescribe them even when medically necessary.
Exactly. And this leads to a broader question that we grapple with time and again. Is it ever justifiable to restrict individual freedoms for the sake of public health or social good?
Right.
It's a dilemma that arises in so many contexts.
We see it with vaccine mandates, surveillance programs, even something as seemingly mundane as zoning laws.
Right.
There's this constant tension between individual liberty and the well-being of the collective.
Remember, the Lawrence Tract, their efforts to engineer a racially harmonious community led them to exclude Black families. It serves as a powerful reminder that even with good intentions, our attempts to manage social outcomes can backfire. And these ethical considerations become even more complex when we're talking about superspreaders.
It does feel like we're entering ethically murky territory, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If we could pinpoint individuals statistically more likely to spread disease, commit crimes, engage in terrorism, would we be justified in restricting their freedom?
It's a slippery slope, for sure. But we can't just ignore the fact that these patterns exist. The challenge lies in figuring out how to navigate them ethically and responsibly.
Transparency and accountability seem like good starting points.
Yeah.
If we're going to use data and algorithms to make decisions with such profound implications, we need to be open about how those systems work and ensure they're free from bias and discrimination.
Absolutely. And we need safeguards in place, to protect individual rights and prevent those abuses of power. That's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It really is, but these are conversations we can't afford to shy away from, especially as technology keeps advancing and gives us access to more and more data about individuals.
This is where the power of storytelling, I think, becomes really crucial.
Okay.
Stories can help us make sense of these complex issues, explore these various perspectives, and grapple with ethical dilemmas in a way that feels human and relatable.
Think about the Holocaust survivors who shared their personal narratives, right? They challenged those dominant overstories. They fostered a deeper understanding of that historical tragedy.
And the evolution of how LGBTQ plus characters are portrayed in popular culture, demonstrates how storytelling can actually shift attitudes and contribute to a more inclusive society.
These examples really underscore that stories, for better or worse, are potent instruments of social change.
Yeah.
And, we need to be critical consumers of those stories, questioning the narratives that were presented with actively seeking out those diverse perspectives.
And we need to be mindful of the stories we tell ourselves, the narratives that shape our own worldview and influence our decisions.
Because ultimately, those personal stories, the individual choices that we make, the actions that we take collectively determine which way those scales will tip.
Yeah.
Will it be towards a more just equitable and compassionate world? That's the question we each have to answer.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Well, it seems we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It has.
It's been a fascinating exploration of these hidden forces, these tipping points, these over stories and all these intricate ways that they shape our world.
Indeed. And as we've discovered, this journey doesn't end here. It's an ongoing process of questioning assumptions, seeking out patterns, and considering the ethical implications of what we learn.
Because the more we understand about how these forces work, the better equipped we'll be to navigate them and maybe even contribute to shaping a better future.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Until next time.